The first gunshot split the dawn like a jagged scar, echoing across the canyon and sending a flock of crows into the cold gray sky. Dust swirled around the auction yard, clinging to boots and skirts, stinging eyes. The early morning sun had yet to pierce the fog, and the wooden planks of the auction platform glistened with frost. For a moment, everything froze: the wind, the dust, the murmurs of the crowd, until the trader shouted over the tension, "Who'll take her?" "Cheap, only $5. The girl stood on the platform, barefoot and trembling, her small frame wrapped in a frayed wool shawl. Her hair, dark and tangled, fell around her face in a way that made her appear younger than her years. She didn't cry, didn't flinch. She just stared at the boards beneath her feet, her dark eyes wide, alert, and unbroken. The crowd of onlookers were a motley assortment: weary cowhands, traders with scarred hands, a few widowed women clutching worn shawls. Some whispered, some laughed cruelly, and others simply stared. But none dared intervene. From the far end of the yard, a shadow moved silently. He emerged from the mist like a phantom, his long black hair adorned with tribal beads and tiny bone charms that clinked softly when he moved. His coat was long and weathered, dark brown, brushing the frost-laden boards beneath his boots. He walked slowly, deliberately, scanning the crowd until his gaze rested on the girl. Tobias Redhawk was 35, an Apache who had spent most of his life in the mountains, valleys, and hidden forests of the West. He carried the solitude of a man who had long ago learned to rely on himself. Yet, in that moment, something stirred inside him, a mix of curiosity, caution, and the faintest flicker of purpose. The trader, a gaunt man with a crooked nose named Mervyn, sneered as Tobias approached. "You're a long way from home, stranger. $5 for this one." "Cheap, cheap." Tobias tossed the coin onto the platform. The copper landed with a dull clink. Silence fell. The girl's eyes flicked up, registering him for the first time. Her gaze was cautious but unwavering, as if she already knew she could trust him. Mervyn shrugged. "Suit yourself, stranger. But don't say I didn't warn you." Tobias lifted the girl in his arms, careful not to jostle her, and turned toward the canyon's winding paths. He ignored the murmurs, the laughter, the stares. He only focused on the girl, on the weight of her in his arms, the rhythm of her breathing, and the sense of life clinging stubbornly to her small frame. Her name was Ivy. At least, that's what he would call her until he learned more. She was said to be deaf, or perhaps mute. Tobias didn't know why someone would sell a child, but the way she stared at him, intense, fearless, curious, told him she was not helpless, not broken, not lost. The canyon air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine, wet stone, and the faint tang of the river below. Tobias moved through the early morning fog with sure, practiced steps, navigating rocks and roots like he had done 1,000 times. Ivy's head rested against his shoulder, her dark hair brushing against his cheek, and Tobias felt a strange mix of protectiveness and awe. They stopped near a hidden waterfall, its roar muffled by the surrounding cliffs. The spray painted the air with mist, turning sunbeams into fractured rainbows. Tobias knelt by the fire he quickly built, the flame flickering in the rising steam from the damp ground. Ivy sat on a blanket he spread, her small hands brushing the embers as if to coax a story from them. He watched her, fascinated as she traced arcs in the smoke, following invisible lines that only she seemed to see. Tobias realized her silence wasn't emptiness, it was her way of connecting to the world, of understanding it more deeply than most people ever could. "What's your name?" he whispered, though he knew she could not hear. Her eyes flicked to him briefly, then back to the fire. It was enough. The first night was restless. Strange noises echoed through the canyon, the distant howl of a coyote, the snapping of twigs, and the ghostly clatter of unseen creatures. Tobias remained awake, listening, alert. He had spent decades alone. And yet there was something in Ivy's presence that changed everything, the way she moved, the way she observed. The subtle confidence in her eyes by dawn, the mist had lifted, revealing the rugged splendor of the canyon. Sunlight glinted off jagged cliffs, highlighting deep crevices and hidden alcoves. Tobias led Ivy along a narrow path lined with moss and wildflowers. Her bare feet stepped cautiously, but with surprising grace, and Tobias felt a flicker of admiration. She was silent, but she moved with the awareness of a child who had survived against impossible odds. As they descended toward the river valley, Tobias noticed signs of life's small footprints pressed into the soft soil. A bird's nest tucked in a low branch and scattered remnants of human activity. He crouched, inspecting a series of marks along the bank. They were too small for deer, too deliberate for mere animals. Someone had been here, someone careful, someone alive and aware. Ivy reached for a stick and began drawing in the dirt. Lines, circles, and symbols emerged, forming a crude map of the riverbank and its hidden alcoves. Tobias bent closer, squinting, and realized that she was communicating. Her gestures were deliberate, meaningful. Somehow, she was telling him something important, a warning, a direction, or perhaps a story he could not yet understand. The day stretched on, and they found a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of moss and vines. Inside were remnants of a temporary camp, a small fire pit, broken pottery, and scraps of cloth. Tobias's instincts screamed caution. Whoever had been here had left recently. Perhaps they had watched, waiting for the girl to move again, that evening. A faint rustling outside the cave made Tobias tense. He crept toward the opening, rifle at the ready, but found nothing, only the soft rush of wind through the canyon walls. Ivy, however, seemed unfazed. She crouched in the corner, tracing patterns on the stone with her fingers, attuned to the vibrations of the earth itself. Tobias realized that her silence was not a weakness. It was a gift. She felt the world in ways most people could not. Later, as they settled near the fire, Tobias allowed himself to speak softly. "You'll be safe with me. I promise." Ivy's eyes met his, dark and unwavering. She raised her hands, pressing them together in a gesture he didn't recognize but instinctively understood as acknowledgement. For the first time in decades, Tobias felt a quiet hope stirring within him. Night deepened, and the canyon seemed to exhale around them. Stars emerged, scattered like shards of light across the sky. Tobias lay back, watching, listening to the river below. He thought about the girl in his arms, about the journey ahead, and about the strange, unexplainable bond forming between them. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of a gunshot reminded him of the danger that followed them, but Tobias was ready. With Ivy at his side, silent but perceptive, he knew they could navigate whatever the West might throw at them. Together, they would carve a path through the wilderness, through human greed, through the silence and chaos of life itself. And so, as the canyon whispered secrets through the night and the fire crackled at their feet, a new chapter began. One of survival, trust, and discovery. One in which a lonely Apache and a deaf girl, misunderstood and undervalued by the world, would face the vast, dangerous expanse of the Old West together. The horizon glimmered with the promise of adventure, but also danger. And Tobias Redhawk, protector, Apache warrior, and now guardian, understood one undeniable truth. Sometimes the quietest souls hold the strongest fire. The river valley opened before them, a silver ribbon winding through moss-draped rocks and tall reeds. The water's surface shimmered like glass, disturbed only by the occasional leap of a fish or the ripple of a drifting log. Tobias led Ivy along the bank, alert to every sound, the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of the current, even the subtle shift of the wind through the reeds. Every detail mattered. Every shadow could hide danger. Ivy walked close to him, bare feet brushing the cool sand and wet stones. She paused now and then, bending down to trace the water's edge with her fingers or press her hand against the smooth bark of a tree. Tobias watched her, fascinated. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a filter, a lens through which she absorbed every nuance of the world. He realized that in many ways she knew more about the landscape than he did. Despite his years living off at Dot, it was near a bend in the river that Tobias noticed unusual tracks in the soft mud. They were small and human, too delicate to belong to any adult man or woman. He crouched, tracing the prints with his fingers. There were clusters, suggesting they moved together, someone guiding another, someone careful. He glanced at Ivy, who had already stepped closer, bending to examine the prints herself. She drew lines in the dirt with a stick, forming patterns he could barely decipher. Her eyes flicked up at him, and he understood instinctively. She was trying to communicate something. "Someone's been here," he murmured. His voice was low, but Ivy flinched slightly, not from fear but recognition. She pointed to the path the tracks followed, then back at herself, then toward the forest lining the river. Tobias nodded slowly. The girl had understood more than he could yet put into words. They followed the tracks upstream, moving carefully through tall grass and over slick stones. The river narrowed, twisting through a pocket of forest that felt untouched by man. The air was heavy with dampness, the smell of earth and moss thick in their nostrils. Ivy's steps were careful but confident. She would pause at points to press her hands against trees, rocks, or the flowing water, reading vibrations Tobias couldn't detect. He realized she had a sixth sense, one that kept them safe in ways his own instincts sometimes missed. It was in a small alcove, hidden behind a curtain of vines and dripping moss, that they discovered signs of life. A shallow fire pit had been recently used, charred wood still faintly smoking. A broken pot and scraps of cloth were scattered nearby. Tobias's jaw tightened. Whoever had camped here had left recently, and the evidence suggested they hadn't expected to be alone. He crouched, examining the markings in the dirt. Small footprints, faint but unmistakable, led further into the forest. Ivy, intrigued, began drawing symbols in the mud, her fingers precise. Tobias watched, trying to follow. Then, as if on cue, a rustle came from the underbrush. He stiffened, raising his rifle just enough to be ready. A boy emerged, no older than 12, with wild brown hair and eyes that glinted green in the filtered sunlight. He froze, taking in Tobias and Ivy, his small frame tense and defensive. Tobias lowered his weapon slowly. "Easy," he said quietly. The boy didn't respond with words, only raised an eyebrow, assessing them both. Ivy stepped forward, unafraid. She mimicked the boy's gestures, pointing at herself, then at him. Slowly, his posture softened, and he nodded, acknowledging her. Tobias felt a strange relief. They had found an ally, or at least someone who meant them no harm. That evening, Tobias set up a makeshift camp along a flat stretch of riverbank. Ivy and the boy shared scraps of food, Tobias silently observing the exchange. Though they didn't speak, there was communication in gestures, in the way the boy handed Ivy berries, in the way she traced patterns on the sand to show him where to sit. Tobias marveled at her resourcefulness. In her silence, there was clarity, patience, and intelligence that no words could capture. As night fell, the river's gentle rush became a lullaby. Tobias had built a small fire, its flames flickering against the darkening forest. Ivy crouched beside him, tracing the glowing embers with her fingers, while the boy explored the edges of the camp, alert yet curious. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and pine, and Tobias's senses sharpened. They were not alone. He had barely settled when he noticed fresh footprints near the riverbank. Larger, adult prints, distinct from the boys' or Ivy's. They led upstream but disappeared among rocks and reeds. Tobias stiffened. Whoever had sold Ivy or whoever sought her now was close. Danger had followed them into this quiet valley. Hours later, as Tobias lay awake watching the fire, Ivy crawled closer and tapped his arm, pointing to the shadows beyond the firelight. He followed her gesture and saw movement figures slipping silently among the trees. Outlaws, he realized, tracking them. He reached for his rifle, heart thumping, but Ivy touched his arm again, shaking her head. Instead of fear, there was intention in her gestures. They needed a plan by dawn. Tobias had packed what little supplies they had and led Ivy and the boy deeper into the forest. They moved along hidden trails, paths Tobias had once used for hunting or escaping the occasional bounty hunter. Ivy's eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, hands brushing against tree trunks or the ground to sense vibrations. Tobias realized she could detect movement long before it reached sight, a silent guardian in her own right. The forest began to thin, and the river opened into a wide pool, reflecting the early sunlight. Tobias paused, scanning the edges. Ivy knelt at the water's edge, running her hands through it. The boy crouched nearby, mimicking her gestures, laughing softly. For a fleeting moment, Tobias allowed himself to relax. Here, among the whispering water and the hum of the forest, they were safe, at least for now. But the respite was brief. Across the pool, a shadow moved. Tobias tensed, recognizing the figure of Mervin's men outlaws seeking the girl, carrying the same cruelty that had sold her once before. They were cautious, not charging, not firing, but the intent was clear. Tobias gripped his rifle, scanning the tree line for advantage. Ivy, sensing his tension, placed a small hand on his arm, steadying him. Her presence reminded him that fear alone was not the answer. Strategy was. They retreated silently along the river, moving through reeds and shallow streams, leaving false trails where they could. Tobias observed how Ivy guided the boy, silently teaching him to move without sound, to sense danger, and to read the landscape as she did. Tobias felt pride, awe, and a deepening bond with the girl he had rescued. She wasn't merely surviving. She was thriving, adapting, and guiding him as much as he guided her. By mid-afternoon, they found a hidden alcove in the rock face, a natural shelter tucked beneath a small overhang. Tobias set up camp, arranging stones for a fire and gathering dry wood. Ivy explored the alcove, running her fingers along the walls, tracing the contours of the stone, seemingly mapping it in her mind. Tobias watched, realizing that her silence allowed her to perceive things he would have overlooked, small cracks where animals might hide, the way the sunlight shifted and revealed shadows. Even subtle sounds bouncing off the rock. As night fell, the tension grew. Tobias kept watch in shifts, while Ivy and the boy slept nearby. But sleep was fitful. From deep within the forest came the distant clatter of hooves and muted voices. The outlaws were still hunting, still following. Tobias's hand rested on his rifle, eyes scanning the darkness, every muscle coiled like a spring. Ivy stirred beside him, her fingers brushing his arm, a silent reassurance. She had become more than a child in need of protection. She had become his partner in vigilance, his guide in a world that had long grown dangerous. When dawn broke, Tobias led them further upstream, where the forest opened into a series of hidden waterfalls cascading into emerald pools. Ivy's eyes lit up at the sight. She ran to the edge, crouching to watch the water swirl, tracing the currents with her fingers. Tobias allowed himself a small smile. For all the danger surrounding them, moments like this reminded him why he had chosen to rescue her. Ivy's presence had brought something he had not felt in years: life, hope, and a reason to care. As they rested, Tobias plotted their next move. The outlaws were persistent, but he had the advantage of knowledge, skill, and Ivy's extraordinary perception. Together they would navigate the river, the forest, and whatever threats emerged. And Tobias knew that each step they took was more than survival. It was a reclamation of freedom, of trust, and of a life worth living. By the time the sun touched the horizon, painting the water in hues of gold and crimson, Tobias, Ivy, and the boy had established a rhythm. They moved with caution, lived with awareness, and communicated through gestures, glances, and the subtle language of survival. And though the danger was never far behind, there was a quiet certainty in Tobias's heart. They could face it together. The river whispered around them, carrying both promise and warning. Tobias watched Ivy as she crouched beside the water, her small hands moving over the surface, sensing currents he could not. He realized that she had survived because of her silence, her intelligence, and her courage. And now, with him by her side, she would not just survive, she would thrive. The valley, the river, and the forest became their temporary sanctuary, a place of preparation for the trials to come. Tobias Redhawk understood that this journey was only beginning. But for the first time in his solitary life, he was not alone. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth from the earth, red and gold streaked with age, shadows pooling in the crevices as Tobias led Ivy and the boy through the narrow passage. The sunlight barely reached the canyon floor, and the air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and wildflowers that clung stubbornly to cracks in the rock. Each step was deliberate, the sound of their passage muted by the natural acoustics of the canyon. Tobias moved ahead, scanning every shadow, every crevice, instinct sharpening with every heartbeat. Ivy followed close, bare feet silent against the dust and pebbles. Her eyes flicked constantly, studying the canyon walls, the ground, even the wind as it stirred loose sand. Tobias noticed the way she pressed her palms against the rock when she passed, as if reading the vibrations of the canyon itself. He realized, again, that her silence was not a weakness. It was a heightened awareness, a skill that kept them a step ahead of danger. The boy trailed slightly behind, cautious but attentive, mirroring Ivy's movements. Tobias's senses were alert to the tiniest shift: a rock that had been disturbed recently, a scratch on the bark of a lone scrub oak, footprints pressed faintly into the dust. Someone had been here, and their presence was deliberate, careful, and most certainly dangerous. Hours passed with little incident, though the canyon seemed alive with whispers. Wind funneled through narrow passageways, carrying echoes that twisted and distorted into ghostly voices. Tobias felt the tension in the air, a quiet pressure that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He moved Ivy and the boy to a small ledge overlooking a bend in the canyon, allowing them to rest briefly. Ivy knelt, tracing the lines of shadow and light across the canyon floor with her fingers, her concentration intense. Tobias studied her in silence, realizing that her hands, in their movements, were telling him things he could not yet fully understand. They continued onward until they stumbled upon evidence of an ambush: broken arrows, faint scorch marks in the dust, and a trampled patch of grass suggested someone had been forced off the trail recently. Tobias's jaw tightened. Whoever had been tracking them was careful, methodical, and likely armed. He motioned for Ivy and the boy to crouch behind a large boulder while he crept ahead. The canyon narrowed even further, the walls almost close enough to touch, shadows stretching into hiding places. From the corner of his eye, Tobias spotted movement. A pair of men, likely mercenaries or outlaws, patrolling the canyon floor. Their faces were obscured by hats and scarves, their rifles cradled at the ready. Tobias's mind raced. They were in familiar terrain, but the outlaws had the advantage of numbers and surprise. He returned to Ivy and the boy, speaking softly. "We'll have to climb. There's a ledge above them that will keep us out of sight." Ivy's dark eyes flicked toward the boulder, then up toward the rocky ledge. Without a word, she began moving, hands finding purchase on small crevices, feet pressing against jutting stones. Tobias followed, guiding the boy, their ascent slow and careful. Dust and loose gravel fell into the canyon below, making faint scraping noises that Tobias hoped would go unnoticed. The men below paused, looking around, but they didn't see the three climbing above them. Once they reached the top, Tobias allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for them to crouch, but it gave them an aerial view of the canyon. Ivy pressed her hands to the stone, her head tilted slightly, sensing the movements below. Tobias realized she could anticipate their next move in ways he could not, and he silently admired her focus and bravery. They stayed in hiding as the outlaws moved along the canyon floor, searching, muttering, and occasionally firing a warning shot that echoed off the walls. Tobias counted their numbers, noting the positions of each man. Ivy, silent but observant, traced the outlines of their movements with her finger against the ledge, creating a mental map that Tobias could follow. Her actions were precise, almost ritualistic, yet effective. By mid-afternoon, Tobias had devised a plan. They would use the canyon's natural curves and shadows to circle the outlaws and create a trap. Ivy and the boy would descend carefully to a lower ledge while Tobias distracted the men with calculated movements, throwing dust and small stones to create illusions of movement. It was dangerous, but he trusted Ivy's instincts. The plan unfolded with tense precision. Tobias tossed small rocks down the canyon, drawing the attention of the outlaws. They paused, rifles raised, scanning the shadows. Ivy and the boy moved along the lower ledge, silent and invisible, using the canyon's twist to their advantage. Tobias felt a surge of pride in the girl's abilities. Her silence was not a handicap, but a strength. An uncanny sixth sense that guided their survival. The confrontation reached its peak when one of the outlaws noticed a shadow flit across a ledge above. He fired, but Tobias had already moved, disappearing behind a jutting stone. Ivy signaled with a slight wave of her hand, and the boy ducked low, holding his breath as the bullet struck a rock just inches away. Tobias felt his pulse race but maintained control. He had done this countless times before, yet this was different. He wasn't alone. He had companions who could sense danger in ways he never could. Hours passed in this silent cat-and-mouse game. The outlaws became frustrated, misled by false movements and shadows. Tobias, Ivy, and the boy maneuvered higher along the canyon walls, eventually reaching a series of natural alcoves that allowed them to rest while remaining out of sight. Ivy crouched, pressing her hands against the stone, tracing vibrations as Tobias explained their next move through gestures. The boy mimicked them quickly, learning without words. As evening descended, painting the canyon in shades of deep red and purple, Tobias led them to a hidden waterfall tucked into a small crevice. The spray cooled the air, and the sound of the water masked their movements. Ivy knelt at the edge, dipping her hands into the water, following the currents with a quiet focus that left Tobias in awe. The boy joined her, learning quickly from her silent instructions. Tobias observed, feeling a profound sense of connection. They were a unit now, forged by circumstance and mutual reliance. That night, they camped in the shelter of the waterfall. Tobias built a fire just far enough to keep the outlaws' eyes from spotting it, but close enough to warm them. Ivy and the boy settled beside him, tracing patterns in the sand, communicating in gestures that Tobias slowly learned to interpret. She had begun teaching him, in her way, the language of her silence. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture meaningful. Tobias realized that she could teach him to see the world differently, to perceive the nuances he had missed in decades of solitude. From the canyon above, distant voices echoed faintly. Tobias stiffened, listening. The outlaws were still searching, though their presence was becoming more sporadic. He motioned for Ivy and the boy to stay low, and they huddled close, moving as one as the night deepened. The stars emerged above, reflected in the pools of water below. For a moment, the danger seemed distant, though Tobias knew it was only temporary. He turned to Ivy, who was kneeling near the fire, her hands tracing invisible patterns in the dirt. Tobias understood that her gestures were more than simple mimicry. They were warnings, observations, and instructions all in one. She had survived so far because of her intelligence, her awareness, and her courage. He felt a swelling pride, tempered by the knowledge that danger still lingered. As Tobias settled for a brief rest, Ivy pressed her hand to his arm, a silent reassurance. He returned the gesture, realizing that in this silent communication there was trust, understanding, and an unspoken bond that transcended words. For all the peril around them, he felt something he had not felt in years, hope. By the next morning, they moved again, navigating the twists of the canyon with careful precision. Tobias led, but he relied increasingly on Ivy, allowing her silent instincts to guide them. The boy mirrored her actions, learning quickly, and Tobias realized they were becoming a team, each contributing in ways the others could not. The canyon itself seemed alive, whispering secrets in the shifting winds. Tobias felt the weight of history in the stones, the echoes of generations of Apache who had moved silently through these cliffs, and he understood that Ivy had become part of that lineage. Her silence a bridge to the past and a key to their survival. By midday, they reached a narrow opening that led to another, even more secluded valley. Tobias paused, scanning the landscape. It was untouched, hidden from view, a sanctuary where they could rest and plan their next move. Ivy knelt by the edge, hands tracing the lines of the valley, sensing details he could not. Tobias allowed himself a small smile. For the first time, he felt that they might endure this ordeal, not because the world was kind, but because they had each other. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in gold and crimson, Tobias realized something profound. Ivy's silence was not a limitation, it was a gift. In the quiet they had found strength, understanding, and unity. Together they had survived ambushes, navigated treacherous terrain, and outsmarted men who had sought to take her from the world. And Tobias knew that whatever lay ahead, he would not face it alone. For the first time in decades, he felt a fierce sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was a protector, yes, but also a companion, a mentor, and something he had never expected. The valley stretched out before them, a hidden expanse of green and gold, dotted with wildflowers and framed by distant cliffs that caught the morning light. Tobias paused at the edge, letting Ivy and the boy move ahead, their bare feet brushing against the soft grass. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of pine and river water. For the first time in days, the danger seemed distant, but Tobias knew better. Outlaws and traitors like Mervyn never gave up so easily, and Ivy's safety had always been uncertain. As they approached a shallow stream, a sudden clatter of hooves rang out. Tobias dropped instinctively into a crouch, rifle ready, and shielded Ivy and the boy behind a large boulder. Dust kicked up on the trail, and Tobias's heart thumped violently. From the rising cloud emerged a figure on horseback, a woman. Her clothes worn but sturdy, dust clinging to her boots and coat, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Ivy?" the woman called, her voice carrying across the valley. Ivy froze, then her dark eyes lit up. She dashed forward, her small hands reaching for the woman's face in recognition. The boy hesitated but watched silently, sensing the reunion's significance. Tobias lowered his rifle, observing cautiously. The woman was Ivy's sister, the one who had never stopped searching, tracing whispers and leads across hundreds of miles. Ivy clung to her sister, and Tobias saw something he had not expected: tears. Soft, quiet, almost hidden, but unmistakable. The woman explained in hurried words that Mervyn had sold Ivy under false pretenses, that the outlaws who had chased them were remnants of his gang, and that they had been searching tirelessly. Tobias listened, his jaw tight, his mind racing. Every piece of the puzzle clicked into place, explaining the persistent danger that had dogged them through the canyon, the river, and the forest. But the reprieve was short-lived. Tobias's instincts screamed as he noticed movement along the valley's edge. Men on horseback, fast and purposeful, were approaching. The outlaws had found them again. Tobias motioned to Ivy and her sister to stay low. The boy crouched beside them, tense, mimicking Tobias's silent gestures. The valley, quiet and seemingly safe moments ago, had become a trap. Tobias's mind worked rapidly. They couldn't run, there was nowhere fast enough to escape the riders. They couldn't stay, they'd be surrounded. The canyon walls, cliffs, and hidden streams were their allies. But here, in the open valley, Tobias needed a plan. And quickly, "Follow my lead," he whispered. Though Ivy and the boy could only see gestures, they nodded, understanding that every movement counted. Tobias scanned the terrain, spotting a narrow creek winding through dense underbrush, barely visible from the open trail. If they could reach it, the foliage and the water's reflection might hide them long enough to regroup. The outlaws spurred forward, rifles raised, shouts echoing. Tobias grabbed Ivy's hand, then guided her and the boy toward the creek. The woman, realizing the urgency, followed, her horse slowing to a cautious pace. Tobias led them through thick brush, mud squishing beneath their feet, the creek curling around rocks and fallen logs. He could hear the outlaws cursing behind them, guns firing into the air in warning, but none could find them. Tobias's knowledge of terrain and Ivy's uncanny perception guided them like a second sense. They reached a shallow pool, and Tobias signaled them to dive behind a thick cluster of reeds. Ivy crouched low, pressing her hands into the water and mud, listening to vibrations, sensing when movement approached. The boy did the same, learning silently from her example. Tobias remained alert, every muscle taut, scanning the tree line. The outlaws had arrived, circling the pool, shouting. But Tobias's strategy and Ivy's guidance kept them concealed. Hours passed in tense silence. The outlaws, frustrated and misled by false trails, began to disperse, some retreating into the hills, others muttering threats before leaving the area entirely. Tobias let out a slow breath, signaling Ivy and the boy that the immediate danger had passed. Ivy's dark eyes flicked toward him, then toward the water, sensing his relief without words. Tobias realized she could read him as easily as he could read the terrain dot as the sun climbed higher. Tobias led the group to a small clearing surrounded by flowering shrubs and ancient oak trees. He built a modest fire, enough to dry their clothes and warm their bodies, but careful not to attract attention. Ivy and the boy explored nearby, tracing the creek's bends, observing birds, and testing the water. Tobias watched them, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. They were safe for now, and the bond between them had grown stronger through shared trials. By midday, Tobias had gathered enough courage to confront the past. "Mervyn," he muttered under his breath, recalling the trader's crooked grin and cold eyes. Ivy's sister's presence gave him the opportunity he had long avoided. Justice, not vengeance, but resolution. Tobias knew Mervyn had to answer for what he had done. They tracked the faint signs left by Mervin's party through the forest and over low hills. Eventually they found him, hiding near an abandoned shack. He was startled when Tobias and the others approached, his eyes widening with recognition and fear. "You," he spat. "Ivy. That's not yours." Tobias stepped forward, hand steady on his rifle, but not raised. Ivy, silent yet commanding, stood beside him, her eyes meeting Mervin's with a gaze that made the man falter. Tobias's voice was calm, but sharp. "She is safe now, and you are done taking what doesn't belong to you." Mervin tried to flee, but Ivy's sister blocked the path, and Tobias moved with precision. The outlaws who had accompanied him had long since scattered. Tobias's stance left no room for argument. Mervin fell to his knees, realizing that his schemes, his greed, and his cruelty had come to an end. Tobias signaled the boy to watch their rear as Ivy's sister tied Mervin securely, ensuring he would answer to the authorities. With Mervin apprehended, Tobias felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders. Ivy, still silent, approached him, hands brushing against his arm in a gesture of gratitude. Tobias nodded, understanding her perfectly. Her silence had never been a limitation. It had been a guide, a protector, and now, a bridge between survival and justice. That evening, as the sun set behind the cliffs, Tobias, Ivy, her sister, and the boy gathered around a fire. Ivy traced patterns in the dirt, teaching Tobias some of the signs she had used to communicate. The boy mirrored her, learning quickly. Tobias listened, absorbed, and felt a sense of belonging he had never known. For the first time in decades, he wasn't alone. He was part of a family, forged not by blood but by trust, courage, and shared trials. Ivy's sister spoke softly, recounting the days she had spent searching, the nights she had worried, and the lengths she had gone to protect her sister. Tobias listened, silently impressed by her perseverance. In her determination, he saw a reflection of his own resolve. Together they had survived, and together they would continue to protect one another. The valley settled into quiet. The creek gurgled gently, birds sang their evening songs, and the first stars appeared above the cliffs. Tobias watched Ivy, who crouched beside the water, pressing her hands against the flowing stream. She traced the current with quiet focus, sensing the world in ways he would never fully understand but had come to respect. He realized that in guiding and protecting her, he had also been guided and protected in return. Night deepened, and Tobias finally allowed himself to rest. Ivy curled beside him, small and warm, the boy resting near her. The sister stayed close, keeping watch over them all. Tobias felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that danger had been confronted, that justice had been done, and that the future, though uncertain, could now be shaped by their own choices. By morning, the group had packed modestly, preparing to leave the valley for a safer settlement. Tobias walked alongside Ivy and the boy, keeping a protective hand near hers. Ivy's sister rode ahead, alert but calm. Tobias knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew that they would face it together. Each of them had found something invaluable: safety, trust, and the unspoken understanding that family is not always defined by blood. As they emerged from the hidden valley, Tobias looked back at the cliffs, the waterfalls, and the river that had sheltered them. Ivy glanced up at him, her dark eyes shining, and Tobias nodded. They had survived ambushes, deception, and the harshness of the West. They had learned, adapted, and endured. And now, with the outlaws behind them and the world ahead, they had a chance to live fully, freely, and with purpose. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Tobias, Ivy, the boy, and the sister moved forward, a small, resilient unit navigating the vast, untamed wilderness. The canyon and river had tested them, danger had sought them, and Mervyn had been held accountable. But the greatest victory was something more profound. They had discovered trust, courage, and connection in a world that often offered none. For Tobias Redhawk, the Apache who had lived a life of solitude, the journey had transformed him. Ivy, whose silence had once seemed fragile, had proven stronger than most who spoke. And together, with those who had joined them on this path, they had carved a future defined not by fear or greed, but by loyalty, love, and the quiet strength of hearts that refused to break. And in the warmth of the morning sun, amidst the gentle rush of the river and the soft whispers of the canyon, Tobias allowed himself to feel what he hadn't felt in decades' hope.